Hello and welcome to the Rogers Brief. I'm Adam Rogers. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening. As you can tell maybe for regular viewers by the sunlight behind me, it's late in the afternoon as I'm recording this, which means that the Mass Casualty Commission put in a fairly full day today. There were 3 items on the agenda here in day 4 of the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings. The day started with a 911 presentation. There was also a presentation on the police perspective on the early events in Portapique, and then finally a very brief presentation by Roger Burrill, Commission Counsel, on the checkpoints that were set up in the immediate time frame after the initial entry into Portapique. So the first part of the day actually went in past lunchtime was the presentation on the 911 system we have in Nova Scotia. And so Daryl Macdonald has the distinction of being the first witness heard by the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings. I say witness, although it was much like a presentation in that it was there was question and answers, but there was some slides to reference, and it certainly seems like they were well prepared with their question and answer session. They talked about how the 911 system works, a lot of technical aspects of it, with the GPS system interacts with it, with cell phones, the different relays that the system goes through depending on the call and the priority of the call. Anyway, all of that seems to work quite well with the civic address system we have in Nova Scotia. So we'll see as the Commission unfolds whether any of that information comes back and is needed in other instances. It was probably most interesting from my perspective, at least, because he was a witness. He was examined, and then there was some cross-examination. But what happened there, his direct examination with Commission Counsel Jennifer Cox, who was with Dalhousie Legal Aid before this, that was done by lunchtime, and then there was a discussion over the lunch break with Commission Counsel and the lawyers for the other parties as to what questions might be asked, if anybody had any questions, and there seemed to have been some agreement reached on that. And when they came back, Ms. Cox asked some of the questions or topics that were apparently discussed, and then there were questions from 4 of the other lawyers. So it seemed like it was a fairly controlled situation. The questions were apparently known and proposed to the Commission over the break, Commission Counsel. One interesting moment, Stephen Topshee, a lawyer from Birch McDougall, experienced lawyer, a partner there, asked a question, was referring to a document, and very quickly Ms. Cox stood up to indicate that wasn't going to be possible to ask the question or reference the document. Anyway, I thought that was interesting that she stood up, and it wasn't the commissioners themselves who addressed the situation as it was unfolding. So that'll be interesting to see how that applies. Certainly Mr. Macdonald was not a contentious witness in any way, so it'll be interesting to see if the parties and their lawyers have questions for other witnesses that they may or may not get approval to ask those questions, and how that situation is handled by the commissioners. So the main important part of the day really was the second part, which was a presentation from Commission Counsel Roger Burrill, who we heard from earlier in the week or yesterday, from the presentation on the early events in Portapique from the perspective of the people and the residents there. Today we heard his presentation from the other side, or from another side, from the police side, and it included some audio of RCMP communications among officers, going back to the dispatch and the supervisor and coordinator. There was some confusion about who the supervisor was at various times, but that it's hard to say what kind of impact that may have had. Mr. Burrill used a map to help orient everybody to where officers were going at various times. So the 3 officers that arrived first were Stuart Basselt, who I know, Adam Merchant, who I also know, and Officer Patton, who I'm not familiar with. Stuart Baselt was stationed in Port Hawkesbury for a while when I was practicing there, doing criminal law. Actually also played hockey against him. He's a big guy. He's probably 6'5" or so. Aggressive, tough hockey player. And I often say that you could tell a lot about somebody by their behavior playing hockey. And so when I knew he was involved in this as one of the first officers there, it turned out to be the very first. I knew that, or I felt I knew that he would probably be inclined to, use that same kind of approach and be, appropriately aggressive under the circumstances. And it turns out he was, as were the other two. Adam Merchant I know as well. He was in Antigonish for a while. Both good officers, had, good file material, seemed to be behave reasonably with people. So the three of them were in there. Officer Patton is a newer officer from what I understand. But they arrived around 10:30 in Portapique, and immediately Stuart Baselt was the first one to arrive, encountered Andrew Macdonald, who had just been shot by the gunman and was leaving the subdivision, the Portapique subdivision, to come out to the main highway number 2. Met Corporal Baselt, not far in the road, and told him what had just happened. Officer Baselt then, the other two officers showed up, and they started down the road of Portapique Beach Road by foot. And the reason they did that was Corporal Baselt's testimony to the Mass Casualty Commission, as relayed by Mr. Burrill, was that the lessons learned from the Moncton shooting from a few years ago now was that a police officer in a police vehicle could really become a target for an active shooter. And so they went in on foot, which anyway seemed like the appropriate thing to do in the circumstances. Certainly a brave thing to do. They walked down the road, ran down the road, it sounded like, to the shooter's cottage, which was on fire. And then they heard gunfire to the east, which was where his warehouse was located. And they went through the woods, pitch dark, through the woods towards the gunfire, and dealt with that situation as they found it there. And then they started to find some of the casualties. They also found the 4 children, the McCulley and Blair children, who were in Miss McCulley's home, hiding, and they dealt with them. They made sure they checked on them from time to time too, made sure they were safe. So I thought that was interesting to hear, and difficult evidence for people to hear, I'm sure, at times too. One of the questions that came up when from that first encounter where Andrew Macdonald meets Corporal Baselt, Andrew Macdonald had been followed at that time by the gunman, who didn't exit the community and go out to the main highway right away, but turned back in, and as we know, ended up going to the Thomas Zal house, set that on fire, killed the occupants, and then proceeded back up through a trail in the woods, is the Commission's hypothesis at least, back to the warehouse area where he shot Corey Ellison there too. So there was some... it's curious, according to Andrew Macdonald and another vehicle that was following behind him, it doesn't sound like Corporal Baselt would have been able to see the gunman's car, and probably the gunman may not have been able to see that there were police officers parked near the entryway to the community. And so I wonder about that, and whether somehow the shooter was aware of police locations, because he turned back in, or if he was just motivated, if he had some sort of plan in mind for the residents of the immediate location, because he went down and specifically, it seems, to the Thomas Zal residence. So we'll maybe hear more as the commission unfolds about motivations that the shooter may have had towards various people within the community. So that was certainly interesting. There was a comment from Corporal Baselt to the supervisor, Staff Sergeant Rahal at one point as to whether the public should be alerted. I think that was about 11:16 p.m. So, fairly early on. I think the killer was gone out of the community at this point, as far as the Commission is aware. But certainly, had that suggestion been acted upon, that would have been significant. The other thing that was significant in that time frame, a Constable Colford was driving to the scene and noticed or said over the radio that people should be aware that there was an alternate exit from the area. Now this was at 10:48 p.m. and the Commission hypothesizes at least that the shooter was already gone from the community at this point, but that still may have been valuable information to head for. Certainly if anybody was coming into the Portapique area from Truro, from the east, they may have had an opportunity to meet that vehicle and done something about it. But that doesn't appear to have been acted upon. The one thing I was watching for, or among the things I was watching for today, was any indication that it may have been a reasonable conclusion for the police to think that the shooter had died in Portapique in one of the fires, had maybe killed himself or just died in one of the fires. And I didn't hear any of that today. I know that had been floated or suggested, I'm not sure by who, but that has been has sort of made the rounds as a theory as to why the police reacted as they did the following morning. So we'll see how that unfolds. We're not going to get that information until I think later in March, when those foundational documents are released for the events of the next morning. But that's certainly something to watch for. No indication in what we saw today that there was. It would have been reasonable for the police to think that the killer had killed himself or was not otherwise on the loose. There was some evidence certainly that he had probably escaped. So we'll watch for that. Now, the rest of this week, tomorrow and Thursday, are going to be taken up by the other participants. We're finally going to get a chance to hear from the other parties and their lawyers. And the purpose of this is to identify any gaps that in the factual record for what we've heard so far. This isn't intended to get into any other part of the time frame. And so it'll be a chance for them to review the factual record, make any comments on what we've heard so far, and recommend further evidence or further witnesses that should be heard by the Commission. So we'll see. That'll be very important. It's the first opportunity for these parties to be heard publicly through the Commission. So I think that'll be very important testimony. So what we heard today. The final presentation was about a 10-minute presentation from Mr. Burrill just on the checkpoints around the immediate area, and really didn't seem like much turned on that. So what we learned today, the first officers in, the three, Basselt, Merchant, and Patton, seem to have behaved fairly aggressively and appropriately aggressively. The supervisors, from what we heard of the communications, seemed inclined to hold back officers and to be cautious about that. So I'm sure there'll be some analysis as to how appropriate that was. It's not clear from what we heard, because the killer was probably already gone by the time much of these things were happening, what difference it may have made. I mean, the only thing I could see, and I'm not recommending that Corporal Basselt should have done this, would have been maybe recklessly aggressive to have gone in by himself. He was about 2 or 3 minutes ahead of the others. Gone in recklessly, aggressively by himself as soon as he spoke to Andrew Macdonald, and done a loop and drove around rather than gone in on foot. May have encountered the killer. Who knows what would have happened? But Stuart Basselt may have been killed himself. Hard to second guess that decision, given certainly what he knew at the time. So it was an important day today. Some difficult testimony, certainly involving the 4 children and the circumstances they found themselves under. The officers were certainly aware of them and certainly were top of mind in their actions as they were going through Portapique. We'll be back tomorrow to hear what the participants think of what they've heard. They have access to all of the source documents, so they would certainly have the ability to poke any holes and identify any gaps, certainly in what we've heard so far. So we'll watch for that tomorrow. Invite you to make any comments on what we've heard today. I'll be back with more reaction tomorrow, and some. You can follow me on Twitter throughout the day as well at Adam Rogers NS. So until then, thank you for watching and thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.